G'day, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the second series of the History in the Bible podcast. More of the history in more of the books in all the Bibles. Episode 2.30, John's Gospel of Knowledge. In the last episode of the History in the Bible, I finished my survey of the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels. Time to tackle the odd man out, the immensely popular Gospel of John. According to the Bible aggregation website, BibleGateway.com, the three most referenced books of the Christian Bible are Psalms, Matthew, and John. In its final chapters, the Gospel itself claims the book was written by the unnamed beloved disciple. The beloved disciple is Peter's best buddy and friendly rival. While the book is coy to the point of disingenuousness about the disciple's identity, all the early fathers thought that he was the Apostle John, son of Zebedee. His Jewish friends called him Yochanan, and his Greek companions, Ioannus. The Gospel of John reads as though it has passed through many hands, a succession of committees. The book is full of awkward transitions and narrative jumps, like a badly edited film. In chapter 5, for example, Jesus has been speaking in Jerusalem. In chapter 6, he's suddenly and inexplicably teleported across the Sea of Galilee. At the end of chapter 14, Jesus declares, "Rise, let us be on our way," and then stays put for 3 more chapters. Modern scholars attribute the book not to a single author, but to an entire school of thought, one we call the Johannine community. The Gospel of John reflects the trials and development of this school over the course of decades. The school encoded its struggles into the narrative of Jesus' life. We have no idea how this community related to the Jesus clubs founded by Paul, or to the communities who read and welcomed the Synoptic Gospels. This community also wrote the 3 letters of John we find in the New Testament. All 4 works regard Jesus in a cosmological way that the other Gospels and Paul do not. All of them talk of the Word, of life, and knowledge. In all of them, a central theme is love one another. John the Apostle was also held to be the author of the book of Revelation. The author of Revelation does call himself John, but makes no claim to be either John the Apostle or John the Gospel writer. The Western Latin Church thought that Revelation was a doozy of a book, one obviously written by the Apostle. The Greek East thought it dangerous claptrap, written by some other person called John. To emphasize that the Gospel is undoubtedly a collective effort, in this episode I'll sometimes use the ungainly term Johannine Gospel rather than Gospel of John. The early church father Clement of Alexandria made the point that John was unusual when he said that the Gospel was written to supplement the other evangelists. No one else bothered to distinguish the first 3 Gospels from John until the Enlightenment, when scholars finally took a good hard look at the book. The Johannine Gospel has a significantly different biography of Jesus to the Synoptics. In the other Gospels, the cleansing of the temple is a crime that sets the authorities on Jesus' tail, leading to his death a week later. In John, the cleansing is the first act of Jesus' ministry. In the other Gospels, Jesus rarely ventures out of Galilee. The only time Jesus travels to Jerusalem is to meet his destiny. In John, Jesus journeys to Jerusalem 3 times. John's account of the Passion Week is also impossible to reconcile with the other Gospels. In a myriad of details, John's timetable of Jesus' life differs from the timetable of the other Gospels. Most scholars regard the Johannine Gospel as the dodgiest source for the life of Jesus, although many concede that John's timeline of the Passion Week is more likely than the synoptic accounts. The 3 synoptic Gospels are theologically defective. None of them holds that Jesus was a pre-existent divine being. To get the real dope, you have to read John. The Church Fathers, Origen and Augustine, the Reformation authors Luther and Calvin, wrote hundreds of commentaries on John. No synoptic gospel ever reached such attention. John reads nothing like the other Gospels. The Gospel's language is strikingly different. John is operating on a wholly different plane. Here are the opening words. Quote, John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. End quote. John's Jesus is the Jesus of modern Christianity. The Johannine Gospel begins Jesus' biography as Mark does with John the Baptist. Like Mark, John has no story of Jesus' birth. Against Mark, Jesus is not adopted by God at his baptism. In John, Jesus is an eternal divine being, the Word of God, who is both with God and was God at the beginning of all things, who became a human. The other Gospels never aspire to John's cosmic imagery. With the use of the word, in Greek logos, John is drawing on ideas alien to the synoptic authors, but present in other Jewish authors. And on that, let me introduce you to Philo Judaeus, an Egyptian Jew who was an earlier contemporary of Jesus, John the Baptist and St. Paul. He lived from about 20 BC to 50 AD. He may have heard the earliest rabbinic thinkers, Hillel, Gamliel, and Shammai. Philo was extraordinarily prolific. He wrote more books than any other author of antiquity. He produced the largest body of religious writing that can be ascribed to a single person before the Middle Ages. He invented Jewish theology. He was often cited by the late Church Fathers. Philo witnessed the birth of Christianity and rabbinic Judaism, yet he shows no knowledge of either. Philo was the first person to discuss at length God's speech or discourse, in Greek rendered as logos. Philo was much influenced by the ancient Greek Platonists, a venerable Greek school of thought, by then 400 years old. Philo decided that God was too transcendent a being to actively intervene in the world. The Tanakh, the Old Testament, says the exact opposite. Say what? And that, said Philo, is why you need me to interpret those books for you. Philo argued that only through God's logos can we know him. Philo dances around the idea of whether the logos is an aspect of God or some sort of semi-divine being in its own right. The Hebrews were likewise unsure if the wisdom or Sophia mentioned in the books of Proverbs, the wisdom of Solomon and Sirach, was a metaphor or real. Philo was preoccupied with reconciling Greek philosophy to Judaism. Moses, he said, has priority in time and in thought. The Greek philosophers just stole from Moses. Yet Philo knew that the Greek philosophies are much more sophisticated than the stories of the Old Testament. Philo invented a new method of reading the Old Testament. He invented the allegory. Allegorical interpretation demonstrated that the Old Testament was cultured and intricate. In this hermeneutic, the surface and literal reading of a text is always the wrong one. A text that says X is a coded message actually saying Y. With this simple concept, Philo effectively reinterpreted the entire books of Moses in Greek philosophical terms. Philo's allegorical forensic was adopted by Christianity big time. Christians turned to allegory whenever they decided that Christians had no need to follow some specific Old Testament law. Oh no, they said, that commandment is just an allegory for a deeper truth. Rabbinic Judaism buried Philo's attempt to harmonize Greek thought and Judaism. Christians embraced Philo's ideas on the Logos. The Gospel of John transformed Philo's tentative concept of the Logos into a key theological concept. The Johannine Gospel incorporates the notion of the Logos into the opening verses of the book. John also alludes to Gnostic ideas, concepts that would have resonated with Philo. I introduced the complex and confusing texts that we call Gnostic in episode 2.22, Battle for the New Testament Part 2, against Marcion. The Gnostics believed that the material world we live in is awful at best and evil at worst. The world was created through a cosmic catastrophe. The Supreme Being is much as Philo believed, not so much an entity as pure thinking. Thoughts emanated out of the thinking. The Gospels often call these thoughts eons. In turn, the emanations or eons thought and emanated. At each stage, the eons became coarser, moving from pure abstraction into rude materiality. One Gnostic myth explains that our world was accidentally created by one of these eons, called Sophia or wisdom. Jealous of the Supreme Being, she gave birth to an inept God, who in turn created the world. This is the Creator God that the Jews knew. In his arrogance and ignorance, the Jewish God thought that he was the only God. This God was a pretty poor creator. He fashioned a world of misery and suffering. Fortunately, the real Supreme Being provided a way out by bestowing some humans with a spark of divinity. If we can come to knowledge of this divine spark, we can be rescued from our bodily prisons. In some Gnostic documents, Jesus is the one to bring us this knowledge or gnosis. Salvation depends on how we, the real us, our minds, can learn how to escape the body and escape this material world. Those with no divine spark are doomed. One major strand of Gnosticism held that the saved were the descendants of Adam's son Seth, and the doomed were the descendants of Cain. We can see some of these ideas in the document called the Apocalypse of Adam, a papyrus recovered in the mid-20th century from Nag Hammadi, a site about 500 kilometres south of Cairo. I covered the excitement of Nag Hammadi in episode 2.18, Modern Debates, scandal of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Apocalypse of Adam is the only Gnostic text entirely devoid of Christian influence. Adam explains to his son Seth how the ignorant creator God brought about the fall of humanity. In this passage, for example, the God who rules the eons is the ignorant God, and the God of truth is the abstract supreme God. Quote, Apocalypse of Adam 1:4. Then God, the ruler of the eons and the powers, divided us in wrath. Then we became 2 eons, and the glory in our hearts left us, me and your mother, Eve, along with the first knowledge that breathed within us. And glory fled from us. After those days, the eternal knowledge of the God of truth withdrew from me and your mother Eve. End quote. We have little clue about the origins of Gnostic ideas. Scholars are still scratching their balding heads, and will do for decades. Clearly, some Gnostic notions derive from the Platonists. By this time in the school's intellectual development, Platonism had decided that the ultimate abstract entity, the One, was incomprehensible to us. The school spent much of its time trying to understand how our gross material world could possibly have originated from the perfect One. So that's one obvious influence. But what is the relationship between all the many, many Gnostic documents and Judaism and Christianity? One puzzle of the Gnostic documents has driven many modern scholars into imbibing one too many brandies at luncheon. Gnostic theologies and stories bear no more resemblance to Jewish or Christian narratives than Hinduism does. Yet the Gnostic documents are abrim with Jewish and Christian references. The Gnostic works hold that evil is written into the fabric of a corrupt world. That is nothing like the Old Testament understanding that bad things happen when people fail to follow God's law. Nor does it follow the late Second Temple Jewish ideas that evil was brought to the world by fallen angels, such as Satan. Nor does it resemble the Christian view that evil results from human sin. One theory, and it's not a bad one, is that Gnosticism was the end stage of a series of intellectual crises in Second Temple Judaism. The first crisis occurred during the early Hellenistic period. After a brief period of delirious joy under the Persians, the Jews found themselves under the yoke of the Hellenes. God had failed to return his people to the happy state they deserved. This was the first crisis. All those apocalypses that I have talked about in earlier episodes were attempts to reassure the Jews that God had not forgotten them. Real soon now, God or Enoch or the Messiah or someone would restore the Jews to their rightful place in the world. Those hopes were bitterly dashed by the Romans. The expectations so aroused by books like First Enoch and Jubilees had come to naught. By the early imperial period, few Jews believed that the hoped-for apocalypse was imminent. God would not save the Jews from the Romans. This was the second intellectual crisis. Gnosticism was a response to the failure of the apocalyptic movements. Don't look for deliverance in this world, the Gnostics said. Aspire for deliverance in the next. The Gnostics referenced Jewish ideas, all that stuff about Adam and Seth, because their roots were in Judaism. We can never know how much Gnostic ideas influenced the Johannine Gospel. Perhaps it is the other way around. Perhaps the Gospel was a source for the early Gnostics. The Gospel is sprinkled with verses that the Gnostics approved of and used. Now, here's a little collection. In these verses, no one has known God before Jesus. Certainly not the Jews, who only know the inept Creator God. Only some people possess the divine spark. Those who do not belong to the world. These elect will be redeemed, but no others. All very Gnostic. Now, long quote, and I'll be jumping all over the place here, so I won't give references. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who's close to the Father's heart, who has made him known. Whoever is from God hears the words of God. The reason you do not hear them is that you are not from God. Jesus answered the Jews, "It is my Father who glorifies me, he of whom you say he is our God, though you do not know him, but I know him. Remember the word that I said to you. Servants are not greater than their master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you. If they kept my word, they will keep yours also. But they will do all these things to you on account of my name, because they do not know him who sent me. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, because they do not belong to the world, just as I do not belong to the world. Righteous Father, the world does not know you, but I know you, and these know that you have sent me. I made your name known to them, and I will make it known, so that the love with which you have loved me may be in them, and I in them." And that's enough from John for the time being. Because the Johannine Gospel entertained Hellenistic ideas, filtered through Jews such as Philo, 19th century professors assumed that the Gospel was written very late, close to the year 175, 2 or more generations after the Synoptic Gospels of Mark, Matthew and Luke. The dating of John was thrown into confusion after a papyrus fragment of the Gospel was uncovered in Egyptian antiquities markets in the 1920s. The piece is the size of a credit card, 3.5 by 2 inches, 90 by 60 millimetres. Scholars know it as Ryland's P52. The current consensus accepts handwriting analysis as showing that P52 was written much closer to 125 than 175. That makes P52 the oldest manuscript fragment of the New Testament in existence, and it would place the writing of the Gospel of John only 1 generation after the synoptic authors, not 2 or more. Until the mid-20th century, most scholars believed that the Johannine authors were unaware of the synoptic Gospels. Today, most hold that they knew at least one other Gospel and adopted that literary form as their own. The Gospel of John assumes you already know the biography of Jesus from somewhere else. The Johannine authors are keen to remedy the deficiencies of the older biographies that failed to explain Jesus' cosmic significance. Apart from the Gnostic secret herbs and spices infusing the book, the Johannine school drew on 2 traditions which seem to be independent of the synoptic sources. One is sometimes called the Book of Signs, and the other the Book of Glory. First and most important is a book of 7 signs, comprising 12 of the Gospel's 21 chapters. The signs include the famous wedding at Cana, the healing of a lame man, the feeding of the 5,000, walking on water, healing a blind man, and raising Lazarus. John is the only Gospel to mention Cana and Lazarus. In the other Gospels, the writers refer to miracles, not signs. In those Gospels, Jesus requires his followers to believe first. When they believe, miracles will follow. The Johannine Gospel inverts that. Miracles cause people to believe. John's stories of Jesus' signs are grander and much more elaborate than the synoptic versions. In the book of signs, Jesus is an impresario who wins followers by working wonders. The second source the Johannine school used is the Book of Glory. That is a narrative of Jesus' passion, from the Last Supper to his death. The synoptic Gospels recount the passion in 2 or 3 chapters. John expands that to 9 of his 21 chapters. The Johannine Gospel's story differs in both the broad strokes and in detail from the synoptics. It has more incidents and a quite different timetable. I'll cover all that in detail in later episodes. The Johannine Gospel is thoroughly familiar with Jewish practices of the time. It often uses arguments similar to later rabbinic midrash. The Gospel paints the Jews as Jesus' arch-enemies. In this passage, for example, Jesus lashes out against the Jews who believe in their inept creator God, and equates them to Satan. Quote, John 8:44. You are from your father, the devil, and you choose to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks according to his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. But because I tell the truth, you do not believe me. Which of you convicts me of sin? If I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? End quote. The Gospel's authors have Jesus contrast spirit and flesh, light and darkness, life and death, salvation and damnation, God and Satan, belief and non-belief. The Jews are always on the wrong side. The view of some modern Jewish scholars is that the Johannine Gospel is rabidly anti-Jewish. Calmer heads argue that the Gospel authors are defending their mixed school Jews, Samaritans and Gentiles against rival Jewish schools, not the entire Jewish people. The author of Matthew did exactly the same. One of the difficulties about reading the Johannine Gospel is that we often can't tell where Jesus' speech begins and ends. Ancient Greek had no punctuation to distinguish speech from narrative. Jesus often refers to himself in the third person. In many passages, we simply can't tell if Jesus is speaking or the authors are narrating. The Gospel declares that everything that God promised the Jews is now fulfilled in Jesus. The book believes that salvation is already here. This is a gospel of the cosmic, one that denigrates the physical world and looks forward to the celestial world. Our world is a place of enmity. The world hates Jesus. The world hates his disciples. The world hates you if you follow Jesus. In the other Gospels, Jesus is Clark Kent, not Superman. Jesus hides his identity. He ambiguously speaks of himself. He demands that everyone keep shtum. Jesus is reserved about his titles. When the disciples acclaim him as a saviour, Jesus rounds on them. You say that I am, implying, but I don't. In the very first chapter, the Gospel of John, on the other hand, proclaims Jesus as the Word, the Light, the Son sent by the Father, Lamb of God, Son of God, Messiah, King of Israel, Son of Man. The Gospel has none of that you say that I am coyness that you find in the synoptics. In John, Jesus is tweeting 10 times a day. At every opportunity, Jesus brazenly declares, I am. If Jesus really spoke like this, why do the synoptics show him as coy? Most scholars think that the demure voice of Jesus in the Synoptics is closer to the historical Jesus than the flagrant announcements of John. I'll finish this episode with another Gnostic-influenced gospel, the Gospel of Thomas. Back in episode 2.27, Searching for the Historical Jesus, I mentioned that a gospel without a narrative, a gospel of only sayings, had been unearthed at a rubbish tip at the Egyptian city of Oxyrhynchus in the early years of the 20th century. In the mid-20th century, the entirety of that text was recovered at Nag Hammadi. The Gospel claims to have been written by Didymus Judas Thomas. Both Didymus, a Greek word, and Thomas, an Aramaic word, mean twin. He is the apostle and doubting Thomas of the Gospel of John. In later Eastern Christian works, Thomas was held to be a spiritual twin brother of Jesus. Thomas became the paramount symbol of a Christian achieving Jesus' own level of spiritual advancement. Indian Christians trace the foundation of their church to Thomas. The book contains over 100 sayings in apparently random order. Most are terse, a few extended. Thomas is nothing like the other Gospels. Jesus is a talking head. About half of the sayings are straight from Mark, Matthew, and Luke. The rest are unknown to any canonical Gospel. Many of the sayings show the same Gnostic influence found in John. Jesus is a cosmic being, present in all things. He is vastly more than the man adopted by God in the Synoptic Gospels. Quote, Thomas 77. Jesus said, I am the light that is over all things. I am all. From me all came forth, and to me all attained. Split a piece of wood, I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there. End quote. True knowledge is a secret, only for the elect. You can only be saved by understanding the secret sayings. Quote, Thomas saying 2. Jesus said, those who seek should not stop seeking until they find. When they find, they will be disturbed. When they are disturbed, they will marvel, and will reign over all. And after they have reigned, they will rest. End quote. Like the Gnostics, the book implies that the things of this world are nothing. Quote, Thomas 37. His disciples said, when will you appear to us, and when will we see you? Jesus said, when you strip without being ashamed, and you take your clothes and put them under your feet like little children and trample them, then you will see the Son of the Living One, and you will not be afraid. End quote. Some of the sayings are just plain peculiar. Quote, Thomas 61. 2 will rest on a bed. 1 will die, 1 will live. Salome said to him, who are you, man, who have come up from my couch and eaten at my table? Thomas 98. Jesus said, the Father's kingdom is like a person who wanted to kill someone powerful. While still at home, he drew his sword and thrust it into the wall to find out whether his hand would go in. Then he killed the powerful one. End quote. Right. One professorial camp holds that the Gospel of Thomas was written very early, around the time of the Gospel of Mark, say between the years 60 to 80. If so, Thomas would be a critically important early source for the words of Jesus. The Apostle Paul, although he wrote earlier, tells us almost nothing of what Jesus actually said. Along with Mark and the Q source used by Matthew and Luke, the Gospel of Thomas would preserve the earliest account of Jesus' words. If many of the sayings in Thomas sound Gnostic to us, then so be it. That is our worry, not Jesus. This early origin camp points to Thomas's primitive features. The book has none of the stories of Jesus' life. No infancy, no baptism, no miracles, no passion, no crucifixion, no resurrection. The opposing camp argues that the Gospel of Thomas dates from a century later, after the Johannine Gospel, around 180. Thomas, they point out, uses expressions from the Gospel of Matthew. Thomas, they say, is just a late Gnostic reworking of the sayings in the Synoptic Gospels. As in all things in biblical studies, there are vested interests. If the Gospel of Thomas was written around the time of Mark or Q, then the long-lost Gospel is a challenge to the sanctity and the primacy of the New Testament. If Thomas was written so early, then surely the book would have been included as the fifth Gospel of the New Testament. Conservative Christian biblical scholars are as one in arguing that Thomas is a late work. I have no opinion on the matter. What do I know? In the next episode of The History in the Bible, I conclude my lengthy prologue to the New Testament with a discussion about the many, many names of Jesus. Thanks for listening. For maps, charts, and diagrams, check out my website, www.historyinthebible.com.